So we've talked about President Kennedy before this video. We talked about him in Unit 4 when we were going through the early steps of the Cold War. We discussed his foreign policy strategy, which revolved around things like the flexible response and the Peace Corps. We also talked about the Bay of Pigs, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and a bunch of other things that happened during his presidency. Now, he was only president for 3 years because of his assassination. It was a short presidency, but there's still a lot of things that happened. It was a very tumultuous time getting into the 60s, so there was definitely a lot of things to discuss. We've already talked about his foreign policy, so now we'll talk about his domestic policy. So his domestic policy was called the New Frontier. So remember, we've discussed what the word frontier means. That idea of unsettled territory, basically like new territory. And that's sort of what he's talking about, the new frontier. We're going to go places in the United States where we haven't been before, metaphorically speaking. So this is going to involve increased government spending in multiple areas. He was an advocate of deficit spending, which, means spending more money than you're bringing in. Now, some of you might be like, that makes absolutely no sense. And that's definitely the opinion of a lot of people, that you should be wise with your spending. But there's also a lot of people out there who believe, you got to spend money to make money, and that it's an investment in the future. And, to a certain degree, deficit spending might be beneficial. He was also a huge advocate for civil rights. We've talked about that in previous lectures. He was one of the first and only presidents to repeatedly side with the protesters of the civil rights movement. And I think the only other president that you could say was, as much of an advocate for civil rights would be Abraham Lincoln. But honestly, I think that Kennedy was more of an advocate, because I think that he truly believed in the moral aspects of equality a little bit less than Abraham Lincoln might have. So a big piece of JFK's domestic policy was the space race. So who are we racing in the space race? The United States, the USSR, right? The Soviet Union. That's who we're up against here. So while we might be racing them to space, what we're doing about it doesn't involve them. So that's why it's domestic policy. Now, NASA was created before Kennedy's presidency, but he's going to help take it to a new level with increased funding and new projects. So he's going to sign off on Project Mercury, which launched the Freedom 7 shuttle. That took Alan Shepard into space, and he became the first American man to enter space. After that, he went on TV and gave this huge press conference, and he said that the United States was going to be committed to having a man on the moon by 1970. I'm sorry if you're hearing my dog's collar. He's running around like a lunatic, and I don't know why this is happening. But anyway, so he commits us to having a man on the moon by the year 1970. That's pretty ambitious. We don't have the technology to make that happen yet. So getting a man on the moon is going to be a really big deal. It's going to take a lot of money, a lot of effort, and so we're really going to just go gung-ho at it from now on. So in February of 1962, we launch another shuttle that gets John Glenn into space, and he becomes the first man to orbit the Earth. He goes up and orbits the Earth, I think 3 times, and then comes back down. So now let's get to what Kennedy is really known for, which is his assassination. So Kennedy's re-election year would have been 1964. So the fall of 1963 is campaign season. If you remember this election cycle that we've just gone through, campaigning and primary season is very long, even if there's an incumbent, which means a person who's running for re-election. Even if there's an incumbent, there's still a lot of primaries and a lot of campaigning that has to happen. Now, not every Democrat was happy with Kennedy. There are plenty of Democrats who thought he was too far left on civil rights. There are plenty of Democrats who thought he was spending too much. There are plenty of Democrats who didn't like the fact that he was Catholic. So there's a lot of people who did not want him to be reelected, even amongst his own party. And one of the people who'd been causing him some problems was the governor of Texas, John Connally. So in November of 1963, Kennedy and his wife Jackie went to went to Texas to meet with John Connally and, speak with him and sort of develop a more positive relationship. While he was in Texas, they scheduled for the presidential motorcade to drive through downtown Dallas in a sort of like a parade. So John Connally and his wife were in the front seat, and JFK and Jackie were in the back seat. As they were driving through downtown Dallas, Kennedy was shot twice. John Connally was also shot. The first bullet that went through Kennedy's shoulder went through John Connally's chest, wrist, and thigh as well. From the way that he was positioned, it ricocheted through his wrist and into his thigh. John Connally did live through that, but unfortunately Kennedy didn't. He was rushed to the hospital immediately, gone into emergency surgery, but he was pronounced dead at 1 p.m. He was 46. So who did it? Obviously, that's the big question. So the easy answer is Lee Harvey Oswald. So Lee Harvey Oswald, who you see here on the right, was an employee of the Texas School Book Depository, which is supposedly where the shot came from. He was arrested that very day for shooting a police officer. Right after Kennedy was shot, Lee Harvey Oswald shot a police officer, and then he was taken in for questioning. Now, Lee Harvey Oswald said that he was never questioned about the president or anything, and he was actually only ever charged with a police officer's murder. He basically said he had nothing to do with it, and that he was being set up, and that he was a patsy for some group who was like conspiring to kill the president. On November 24th, 2 days later, Lee Harvey Oswald was being taken from the Dallas jail to court to be arraigned, and Jack Ruby, who you see pictured right here, walked up in the crowd and shot Lee Harvey Oswald at point blank range, and he died. Jack Ruby was charged with murder and convicted. Pretty hard to say he didn't do something when he did it on national television, which is how that happened. Jack Ruby was a nightclub owner there's a lot of, conspiracy theories about Jack Ruby and why he did this. But because he killed Lee Harvey Oswald, we'll never know for sure if Lee Harvey Oswald killed Kennedy. He was never charged with Kennedy's murder or anything like that, and we never really got to hear what LHO had to say about the whole thing. So, unfortunately, we have to go off of sort of the rest of the evidence, which is not very reliable. So Jack Ruby did appeal his conviction later on and got a new trial date, which is sort of a miracle. You got to have some serious evidence to get a new trial date. But he died of cancer in 1967. He was diagnosed with cancer and died like 2 weeks later, right before his new trial was about to take place. So Vice President Lyndon Johnson is going to be sworn in a few hours after Kennedy is killed, and he's the new president. So he's the one heading up this investigation. He creates the Warren Commission, which was headed up by Earl Warren, to investigate Kennedy's death. And the problem with the Warren Commission is that all the evidence they looked at was evidence given to them by the FBI. And essentially, when they were done their investigation, they published a report saying that Lee Harvey Oswald did it and he did it alone. But this was not enough for people. People were not satisfied with this answer. Even, in 1965, people were developing conspiracy theories about all of this. So in 1979, much later, the House Select Committee on Assassinations was formed, and they did a new investigation exploring evidence outside of what was provided by the FBI and including new witness testimony. And they published their report ruling that there was most likely a conspiracy involving other people to kill Kennedy and possibly involving a second shooter. But the case was closed and nothing was ever done with the report. It was just published, and the U.S. government has gone on with its life. So studies show that an overwhelming majority of Americans believe that Kennedy's death was the result of a conspiracy. And the 5 most popular conspiracy theories involve the CIA, Lyndon Johnson, Cuba, Russia, and the mafia. There's significant evidence for actually all 5 of those theories, and then significant evidence that debunks all 5 of those theories. So you'll draw your own conclusions. But nevertheless, what this does is it breaks trust between the United States government and its people. For the leader of the free world to be taken from us in such a violent way, and the U.S. government to say there was a conspiracy, but we're not going to do anything about it, is pretty significant. And we're going to see a new generation of people growing up instilling into them the idea that their government can't be trusted and that it lies. So LBJ, definitely one of the most entertaining presidents that has ever had the honor of leading our country. So Lyndon Johnson, we talked about before, he's a Democrat from Texas. He had a Navy background. He had a background in the Senate as well. So he definitely had the type of resume you would want to see a president have. He had run for president in 1960 in the Democratic primary, but lost to Kennedy and become his vice presidential pick. So Lyndon Johnson's foreign policy is all wrapped up in Vietnam. So his domestic policy is what we'll talk about here, and his domestic policy was called the Great Society. This is sort of the idea that we're going to improve American life on every level. The Great Society involves things like being pro-civil rights, providing more funding for public broadcasting, healthcare reform, more funding for education, help for the arts, rural development, public services, tons of different things. But the largest piece of this pie is something that LBJ called the war on poverty. So by the time he gets in office in 1963, 1964, the national poverty rate was about 19%. So he makes it his mission to eradicate poverty in the United States. He starts off by passing the Economic Opportunity Act and establishing the Office of Economic Opportunity. And what that does is it essentially creates welfare. It administers, local offices for the Office of Economic Opportunity to distribute federal funds to people living below the poverty line, which is essentially what welfare is. He's also going to expand education. It's proven that a long-term solution to poverty is, increased education. You make it more possible for people to be able to take care of themselves, take care of their families, and contribute to society. So helping out in education is a big way to help your country. So he also is going to revolutionize healthcare with two things, Medicare and Medicaid. So Medicare is healthcare for the elderly, and Medicaid is healthcare for the poor. He's also going to create programs like Head Start, which is daycare, childcare for working families who can't afford other childcare, VISTA, which stands for Volunteers in Service to America, kind of like the Peace Corps except at home. So they do the same things as the Peace Corps would do, but they get sent to places inside the United States. Perhaps, like rural Mississippi, inner city Harlem, just different places like that. And he also creates a Job Corps, which is a job training program where they teach you a skill and then get you a job afterwards. It's a program that's still around today. So a lot of these things that he starts here in the war on poverty have a very long-lasting legacy. And what we mostly remember LBJ for is Vietnam, but these things still touch us today even more than Vietnam does.